William Strafe, and welcome to the Heads Up Podcast, Episode 7, for May 12th, 2012.
Now that I've effectively shredded my vocal cords, the final episode of Season 1 of Elements of Play is up over on Machinima. Go ahead and check it out if you want to. Kind of curious whether or not this episode will end up inadvertently pissing off a lot of people like last week's episode. Completely didn't see that coming. But like normal, if you want to see the episode, go ahead, check the description for a link, or check the annotation in the video. On the note of how the last episode of Season 1 is airing today, this is also the last podcast that's going to be airing for a while, seeing as how I only really put these podcasts up so people can get to new episodes fairly easily. It's been a fun run for the first season, both with the podcasts and the show itself, but now I'm going to go quiet for 1 or 2 weeks so I can finish crunching my time to complete Season 2 so it can go up on time, which will presumably end up starting in 1 or 2 weeks itself. I'm not entirely certain when Season 2 will debut. I still haven't discussed it with Machinima yet. So of all the subjects I'll bring up this week, I figure the first one that I would start with is how a lot of you guys seem to really freak out about the fact that I made 2 small typos in the last podcast. I'm really surprised that so many people took up an issue with the fact that I misspelled Dawnguard and history. I really wasn't expecting anyone to actually notice, and on top of that, I was kind of in a rush to get the video out. I had to re-render it, I think, about 5 or 6 times last week. I kept getting errors whenever I was working on it, so as a result, I was kind of, I was glossing over a whole lot of the work, and I didn't notice that I had misspelled a couple of things. That being said, a typo is a typo. There's no real reason for you to get bent out of shape about it. I'm a little bit entertained by the fact that so many people were just kind of floored by the fact that I can make a typo. I go out of my way to try and make certain that those things don't happen, but I'm not perfect. And if you go back and do very detailed checks on some of the video guides that I've done in the past, you'll see that I make some mistakes. One of the most common things that I end up screwing up in my guides is I'll mix up east and west very frequently. I don't know why I always do, but, I'm not perfect. Typos are typos. I'm entertained by the fact that so many of you were surprised about it or took issue with it. I could care less, quite honestly. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. Now, the first authentic, juicy piece of information that I think is worth bringing up this week pertains to how I published my top 10 list 2 weeks ago now, and I'm assuming that many of you listened to that list, and many of you know that my top number 1 game is the original BioShock made by Irrational Games. And obviously, if you watched last week's Elements of Play video, you know that I have a less than positive opinion of BioShock 2, which definitely had a whole lot of honest improvements on gameplay mechanics, but whenever it came right down to it, there was no real effective reason for it to happen canonically. And, the story wasn't that great in my opinion, but that's not the point. The point is, BioShock is the number 1 game on my list, and as a result, this piece of news is a really big deal for me, and presumably, or at least I hope, it's big news for many of you too. BioShock Infinite, that is also developed by Irrational Games and, directed by Ken Levine, the mastermind behind the original BioShock, has been delayed until next year. It was originally slated for release of sometime in October of this year, 2012. It just came through the line late this week that BioShock Infinite is not going to be released in October, and it's been pushed back to February of 2013. Now, personally, I've got a bit of an issue with that for the fact that I have to wait longer, but at the exact same time, I don't really have much of a problem with the fact that, if a game needs to be delayed in order to be complete without bugs, and, if they're, especially in the case of Irrational Games and what Ken Levine does with the titles that he creates, I mean, I love the way that he and his studio work and the way they build up the story and the world, and it's very immersive, and it's very, very dazzling in how he puts his games together. So as a result, I completely respect the fact that the game is being delayed for the better good, and moreover, I am also fine with the fact that they have made the choice not to show off BioShock Infinite at E3 this year. They might not even have a presence at E3. I don't know if it goes that far, but what's to be certain is that BioShock Infinite will not be seen at E3 this year because, as Ken Levine said, you have to plan for those events, and because they're asking for an extension right now, they want to dedicate all of their time to working on Infinite to make sure that they have everything right so they can meet the next deadline, just so they can put as much polish on that game as possible so it meets the standards they have and it is the game that they want to release. But like I said, I'm disappointed by the fact that I have to wait longer, but at the same time, it's kind of a relief for me because there are a whole lot of games releasing, in the October-November time frame this year that I'm going to, probably be picking up on the day they come out or, within 1 or 2 weeks. Games like Assassin's Creed 3 and Borderlands 2, probably Dishonored 2 since it finally got a release date. That actually segues into the next topic that I want to bring up. Dishonored has finally received an official launch date. It's October 9th of this year. And I'm actually more or less looking forward to Dishonored. I'm, not going to pass any judgment on it right now. I'm not going to get hyped up for it. What I do know is that Dishonored is a game that looks good. It's the type of game that I'm interested in. I really like games that take place from a first-person perspective and aren't dedicated as shooters, which is the reason why I like the Elder Scrolls series. Another reason why I'm looking forward to Dishonored this year is because of the fact that I really do enjoy games that take place in either a steampunk or a cyberpunk world. For instance, I really like Deus Ex: Human Revolution just for its pure look and its atmosphere and how it completely dripped, and it was very immersive with its art direction and its design. And Dishonored is a game that quite clearly has a very specific direction. It's very steampunkish, and because that was also present in BioShock, it really does appeal to me, the entire steampunk genre. So Dishonored is definitely a game that I'm looking forward to, and I guess you could kind of say that it's a trade-off or a consolation prize in a way, because now that BioShock Infinite isn't being released in October, just 2 days later after that announcement, I find out that Dishonored is going to be released in October this year. So, it's not exactly the game that I was hoping for, but at the exact same time, I'm very pleased to find out that there's another game that's coming out that I am still interested in, and I'm no doubt going to be picking up, and it's going to be released, more or less, kind of in my book, in place of BioShock Infinite, even though I don't want to lead anyone to believe I'm trying to compare the games. While I'm on the subject, I might as well take the opportunity to answer a question that came through on my blog whenever I mentioned the release date for Dishonored. And the question is more or less, who's developing Dishonored? Now, the actual studio responsible for the development of the game Dishonored is Arcane Studios, and this is the same studio that developed the game Dark Messiah of Might and Magic. Some of you may have heard of it. It was released back in 2006, and it took a first-person perspective. It was a really interesting game. It was kind of like, if you ever saw gameplay footage of this, it looked very similar to Oblivion, which was released in the same year. But it wasn't as large of a game. It wasn't an open-ended game, really. It was a much more linear structured game. And Arcane is the same company that is or has created Dishonored. Now, Bethesda is only involved because they are publishing Dishonored, which means they are only responsible for getting that game onto discs, into boxes, and then out onto store shelves. Arcane Studios is responsible for all of the content, which you or I or anyone else will play whenever they pick up the title. But anyway, those are the two big pieces of information that came to surface this week, in my opinion. The fact that BioShock Infinite was pushed back from October to February of next year. Anyways, moving on. I might as well touch on this subject even though I spoke at length about it last weekend. There's finally some substantial information available about the Elder Scrolls Online because its feature article that's around, I think 16 or 18 pages long in the Game Informer magazine, which I am subscribed to, has finally gone out. And after reading through, not the entire article, I didn't have time, but a substantial amount of it, I'm feeling more and more insecure about the Elder Scrolls going online, and the reason why is because of a specific comment that came through, I think on my blog, the individual who made the statement was saying something along the lines of, if the game doesn't have a first-person perspective mode, then there's just no hope for it, I won't play it, whatever. And that actually made me think for a second. There has never been an Elder Scrolls game before that could not be played from the first-person perspective. In other words, in the first two games, you could only play from a first-person perspective. And then third-person perspective was added in Morrowind, and it was available in Oblivion, and then it became something that was only functional enough to use in Skyrim. But massive online RPGs, or MMORPGs, they really are locked into that concept of, a third-person perspective. The camera is not in the character's head, it's hovering behind them. And it made me realize something. I don't think that it's going to feel anything like an authentic Elder Scrolls game if you can't play from a first-person perspective. I mean, the series is just so closely tied to that, and it's made me realize that something is definitely going to feel wrong about the MMO if it doesn't have that. And after reading a significant amount of the article in Game Informer over the Elder Scrolls Online, I'm led to believe that there is no first-person perspective for the game. And if that is indeed the case, then, geez, help us all, because the first-person perspective is such an important factor in the Elder Scrolls series as a whole thus far. As I was reading the article, I was also very discouraged by a lot of the things that they were talking about, the way they were describing the game. Sure, you're not, trying to combo your moves or anything, you're just running through the regular routines like in World of Warcraft, using those skill buttons on your hotbar. And as I was reading these things, I just thought to myself, wow, this is not good. This is not good at all. And I don't know, maybe I'm being overly skeptical. Maybe I'm just kind of burned out of the concept of doing online gaming anymore after all the years that I spent playing World of Warcraft whenever I was still in high school. But I am remarkably concerned for what's going to happen to the Elder Scrolls, especially if the Elder Scrolls Online turns out to be successful. Who knows if it will or not. But I think I'm rambling at this point. The entire idea here is that, from what I can tell, there is not going to be a first-person perspective in the Elder Scrolls Online. Now, hopefully I'm wrong about that and I've misconstrued something from the information I've read, but as it stands, if the Elder Scrolls Online has no first-person perspective option, I think there's a big problem on the horizon, because that's one of the cornerstones of the series itself. Alright, enough about the Elder Scrolls. Moving on to the subject of a game that's on the absolute horizon. I hope that most of you are already aware of this game, but this Tuesday, the 15th, Diablo 3 is scheduled for release, and that's one of the games that I have gone through the trouble of reserving and completely purchasing, and I'm entirely ready to go out to the store Monday night for the release party to pick up my copy, and then, hurry on home and get it onto my computer so I can probably waste a considerable amount of time over the next 2 weeks or so just grinding away for hours on end, killing hordes and hordes of monsters. I'm curious how many of you will also be engaging in the Diablo 3 madness in a few days to come. I am very much so looking forward to this release, even though I didn't have time to participate in the open beta. I wasted a whole lot of time playing through the original Diablo years ago. I spent tons and tons of time with personal friends on LAN parties with Diablo 2, and also Lord of Destruction. So naturally, Diablo 3 is a game that I have had my sights on for a while, and, Torchlight, which was released a few years back, I found that to be a really good game that satiated my appetite for it, or basically staved off the beast. But it's inevitable that Diablo 3 would eventually happen, and there's nothing that can really replace it. It's the original, the absolutely awesome hack and slash. Anyways, I'm very much so looking forward to the release of Diablo 3 later this week. And for those of you who are still playing on PC today, and will be playing Diablo 3 in the same time as me, go ahead, speak up down in the comments. I'm really curious how many of you are going to be picking up this game, considering the fact that it's a computer exclusive, whether you're running on a Mac or a PC. But anyway, I'm excited about Diablo 3, looking forward to it, hope you guys are too. And with that, let's move on to questions. Alright, this first question comes from Mr. Glitterfist, who asks, are you a fan of the Final Fantasy games? It would be interesting to hear what you like about them, what you don't like about them, which is your favorite, etc. Well, first of all, I guess I'll establish which Final Fantasy games I've actually played through. Final Fantasy 7, 8, 10, and 13. As far as Final Fantasy 12 goes, I purchased the game the day it came out, and I just wasn't really interested in playing with it at the time because Oblivion was happening in my life at the exact same time, so I didn't bother with it much. I did pick up Final Fantasy 12 again, close to a year ago now, I think, and I got really, really far in the game, but then other titles started to be released. And actually, FF12 is one of the titles that I really, really want to go back and finish, but the problem is that the main reason why I put the game down was how I was stuck in a situation of grinding so I could beat a boss. And that's really the big thing that I hate about the Final Fantasy games the most. Now, as far as my favorite game out of the series, I mean, you could dice it up pretty well. I think that the combat in Final Fantasy XII is some of my favorite because of the fact that it really does feel like I'm playing a massive online game without having to deal with other whiny idiots on the internet and whatnot. But at the exact same time, I can't really deny the quality of the combat in Final Fantasy X, which was authentic turn-based combat. It wasn't time-based. You didn't have a bar representing the time to count down before each character got another turn. And as far as story goes, I find that there's no getting around it. I think that the story in Final Fantasy VII was the absolute best. And there's a lot of contributing factors for that. One, I found Cloud to be a very unique character that I really, really liked. I really enjoyed watching the love triangle develop between Cloud, Tifa, and Aeris. The big thing that really drove Final Fantasy VII to be the best for me was the fact that it was the very first Final Fantasy game that I ever played in my lifetime. And I think it took me around a year and a half to beat the game. It wasn't my very first experience with RPGs or Japanese RPGs, but it was the very first Final Fantasy experience that I ever had. And prior to Final Fantasy VII, I had never played a game that was that long, had a story that deep, had that many intricacies to it. So naturally, that had a really profound effect on me, and for that exact same reason, I was one of the people who was absolutely giddy whenever I found out that they were doing the Advent Children movie all those years back. But the secondary factor that really makes Final Fantasy VII stick with me is the fact that they did such an incredibly good job developing their characters, and then all of a sudden they kill Aeris off very, very quickly, very suddenly, without any real express purpose other than the fact that that is what Sephiroth did. And for those of you who are completely lost, I'm sorry I can't exactly explain the entire story of Final Fantasy VII, but the fact of the matter is, they killed off a very large character, I think about a third of the way into the game, and it had an enormous impact. I remember whenever I watched the sequence the first time, and I was just absolutely stunned. I was floored. I was heartbroken at the exact same time, because Aeris was a very, very nice girl. She was a great character, and then they just killed her. And, having a climactic and very, very heartfelt and sorrowful event like that really drove the story home to me, and it made me care that much more about going through the rest of the game and completing it, and seeing the ending. Now, as far as the games as a series that I don't really like, first, like I said before, they're a grind fest, and I really don't like grind fests unless I really think that performing a grind fest in a game is not a good thing, because it detracts from the fun that the game has, in my opinion. In all honesty, if a level system is employed in a game, I think that it's best put to use if the player never feels that they have to sit in one spot running around in circles trying to level themselves up to get something done. I think that leveling is best put to use whenever you don't realize that you're leveling up, and it's not your focus. It's just one of those things where you're just kind of running along through the game, doing your thing, and then all of a sudden, boom, you've got another level, and you're like, oh, hey, that is great, that is awesome, because now I'm more powerful. But the games where you end up sitting in one spot, running around in circles, killing the same enemies over and over, saying, God, I just need like 1, 2, or 3 more levels before I can beat that freaking boss. that really isn't a good thing in my opinion, and unfortunately the Final Fantasy series definitely clings to that grind system. I remember a lot of the trouble that I had in Final Fantasy VII whenever I played through it. Some of the bosses were very difficult. The exact same thing with, Seymour Flux in Final Fantasy VII. It's the exact same reason why I put down Final Fantasy XII and I haven't picked it back up. Final Fantasy XIII never gave me that problem, but at the same time, Final Fantasy XIII is not your typical Final Fantasy. As far as FF13 goes, I bought that game the day it came out, which just so happened to be right on top of spring break, and I took that game home, I sat down, and for all of spring break, I played that, I went to work, I came home, I played that, and I beat the entire game inside of 1 week. I put it down, and I've never picked it up again. As far as the story in Final Fantasy XIII goes, Final Fantasy XIII has a lot of conflicts in it. I enjoyed the combat system in it because I found it to be very gratifying, very intuitive. It was very chaotic, but at the exact same time, if you knew what you were doing, you could really control it to an incredible degree. And obviously the graphics were great. It was a very well put together game as far as visuals go. I had major convictions about the fact that there were no towns. You were basically running through corridors through the entire game. And above everything else, I found that Final Fantasy XIII had one of the absolute weakest stories out of all the Final Fantasies I've ever played. And there's a lot that can be said about it. The entire game can be broken down, but I never really understood why on earth any of the protagonists in that story were running. And to top it all off, there was no well and properly defined antagonist throughout the entire story. There was no definitive villain that you were faced against. And that was a major problem, especially considering the fact that I found the characters in Final Fantasy XIII to be so well defined. It created a very, very strong conflict of feelings whenever I played through the game and after I finished it, because it was literally a scenario of, wow, why does it feel like that was something really, really amazing that wasn't worth playing? That was really what I got out of the end of it. And since I'm on the note of Final Fantasy XIII, I also have the sequel to it, even though I haven't opened it up yet. I found it used over at the game shop and figured, hey, it's cheap, why not? Granted, I'm not exactly expecting a whole lot out of it, but nonetheless. Now I've just realized that I've more or less lost my train of thought, and I don't actually know the direction that I was attempting to go with this answer. I've kind of been all over the place in answering the question about Final Fantasy. I suppose, as a whole, the Final Fantasy series is something that I like, but, it's really showing its age, and they're trying to change it. They're not being very successful about it, though. For any of you listening right now, if you want to know more about a specific Final Fantasy title, go ahead, say something down in the comments, because to be quite honest, the question about the Final Fantasy games or the series as a whole, that's a little bit too broad for me to cover. Off the cuff, I need something a little bit more specific. But that's my answer as best as it can get for the series. Like I said, if any of you are interested, go ahead, ask me questions about any specific game out of the series that I said that I played, obviously, Final Fantasy 7, 8, 10, 12, and 13. Moving on to the next question. Okay, this next question comes from Skater for Baker, who asks, I would really like to know your thoughts on Borderlands 2. Are you excited about it? I don't think that I would say that I'm excited about Borderlands 2. Granted, it is a game that I will pick up and play through this year, mostly because I ended up playing the first one after watching a review over it, and it turned out to be a whole lot more fun than I expected it to be. Like I said earlier, I'm kind of put out with games that rely very heavily on a grinding system to keep you busy, but in the case of Borderlands, whenever I played that, I found that I wasn't so much focused on the grinding system and leveling up wasn't that difficult. I found myself spending most of my time in that game just trying to chase after a better gun. I had an absolutely insatiable appetite for trying to find a better gun than the one I was using, and that was really what drove me to go through the game, And in the process, I would level up and I would be like, oh, hey, that's fantastic. Now I can get my hands on better guns. And that's really the big reason why I liked the original Borderlands. That being said, it really didn't hold much of anything for replay value. The story was flat out bland and almost non-existent. Borderlands didn't have a whole lot of redeeming qualities. It just had a very strange mixture, and it was dropped in just the right time to be a successful game, in my opinion. Actually, if you want a more put-together diagnosis or breakdown of why Borderlands is a good game, I know that I did a blog about it quite some time ago. If you look on my channel, you'll probably find it. For the sake of simplicity, I'll put a link to it down in the description as well. But I broke the game down a while ago as to why the game is so fun and why it can hold your attention and everything. But as far as Borderlands 2 goes, it is a game that I will pick up and play this year. I'm not what you would call excited about it, but at the exact same time, it's a title that I'm very much so interested in experiencing. As long as it does the exact same thing that the first game did, I really don't see how it can flop. And moreover, all I'm looking for out of the game is basically a change of location, different guns, a new class system with talent trees and everything. So I end up getting a different game experience, but literally using the same game mechanics of run, shoot, kill, level up, get better guns, repeat. So yeah, the simple and straight of it, not excited for Borderlands 2, even though I do look forward to playing it this year. This question comes from Dark Halo Assassin, who asks, okay, this might be different for you, but what is the status of survival horror games, and how might it improve right now? A little bit more put together way to ask that question, and moreover, what I think you're asking is the current position of survival horror games in the market today, and how they can make some sort of a comeback. And if that is indeed what you're asking, there's a couple of things to cover as far as the survival horror genre goes. First of all, survival horror, the genre within itself, your traditional Resident Evil and your Silent Hill games, they've more or less died out. I mean, obviously not entirely. It's a blanket statement that's not completely true, but by and large, you don't really see many survival horror games released today. And there are a lot of reasons for that, and it ties into the fact that most people do not like survival horror games for the fact that there's a lack of proper control traditionally with it. You're helpless. Basically, it boils down to a fact that there's a lack of action in the survival horror genre, because survival horror is not about facing waves and waves of enemies. It's about being incredibly insecure and concerned about the next enemy that might be around the corner, not having enough ammo, not being able to absolutely tear things up in combat. That's the big thing that seems to be limiting survival horror, and the reason why it's not that popular today. Because most publishers and developers have ended up rolling over to the sister genre of survival action, which is, your Resident Evil 5 or your Left 4 Dead games, where you're more concerned with figuring out how to fight your way through waves and waves of zombies or something, instead of being concerned with trying to get out. These two genres have their pros and their cons, but survival horrors have fallen behind primarily because of Resident Evil 4 that was released all of those years ago, which introduced the survival action genre. That being said, I think that the biggest thing that could push survival horrors to be successful again is a return to formula. What most publishers and developers need to remember, and gamers as well, though not as much, what they all need to realize about the survival horror genre is that it's not about high quality graphics, it's not about how horrifying you can make the monsters. It's about trying to unnerve the player. It's about what's behind the corner, what is beyond the fog, what can I not see, because your mind is far more capable of scaring you than any high definition graphics are. And as unfortunate as it is, developers seem to be fighting against this idea, thinking that we have high-definition graphics, so we have to make use of them. And while that is true, high-definition graphics are useless if they aren't put to good use, horror games are not at their best whenever the HD graphics are used to show grotesque or creepy creatures. And I don't exactly know the best way to put HD graphics to use in horror games, but to be quite certain, implementing proper combat is necessary for survival horror genres to continue to exist today. Beyond the graphics, most developers need to realize they need to come up with a way to keep gamers feeling insecure and helpless, while at the same time not impeding their capability to control the character, navigate the world space, and basically interact smoothly. That's the big thing that sets survival horrors of the past day apart from any given survival horror of today. I'll use the plain example of the Silent Hill games and, say, Condemned Criminal Origins. The Silent Hill games did not have smooth controls. They were, very, very clunky, and they put you in a very awkward situation when it came to combat and trying to run away from enemies. As far as Condemned goes, that's got to be one of the most scary games that I've ever played, because it puts you in a first-person perspective, and it gives you all the control you really need. But the way the game is designed, you're not focusing on using guns, you're focused on using melee weapons. And as a result, you obviously have to get much closer to the enemies. It puts you at a higher risk of danger, and when you hear something running around, and the fact that it can sneak up on you and hit you, because, let's face it, even as liberating and as common the first-person perspective is in games, it gives you a large amount of space that you can't actually see. You can't see behind your character and whatnot. So as a result, the first-person perspective really works for survival horror games. The catch is getting away from the mechanics that most people have come accustomed to in first-person shooters, such as regenerating health and always having a gun in your hand. But to sum up the answer fairly quickly, the way that survival horrors can make a comeback or improve today is that developers need to realize that they need to focus more on scaring the player through possibility and not scaring the player through showing them anything. And once any developer gets that down, they can really make a good survival horror, because it's all about what could be there, not what is there. Obviously, whenever something actually pops up, you're freaking out in a different way than you were whenever the tension was building. But that's the very simple answer to it, and I suppose it's a more philosophical answer than it is technical. Alright, I'm going to answer two questions in tandem now, because they very closely relate to each other. And the first one is more of a statement than anything else, and it's from Lightning Spartan, who said, "For your next podcast, you should talk about the dumbing down of games for the masses." And this ties in directly with a question that Impovier asked, saying, "Could you go into more detail how Skyrim trades a lot of things off to be more streamlined?" I don't really want to get too deeply into this, but Skyrim traded off the complexity of its menu system in order to cater to the simplicity and the limitations of a game controller. I mean, if any of you think that the menu system in Skyrim is superb and it's top-notch, then you obviously haven't tried to use it on a computer, and that's one of the largest problems. A computer has a much more complex interface system. It's capable of more things than a controller, and then Bethesda decided to design its menu system strictly for a controller, and as a result, the computer interface completely suffered. To put it really simply, if you surf menus on a computer, you usually expect to use the mouse, right? Well, on the computer, because it's no different from the console version of the menu, surfing with the mouse actually causes a lot of trouble, and you have to, basically let go of the mouse and do all of the work with your keyboard if you want to be able to navigate the menus efficiently. Other things that they traded off would be the number crunching. It's up in the air whether or not it was a truly bad idea to take away the ability to change the numbers of strength and endurance and agility and whatnot and how they influence your character, but overall, the removal of those things, I feel, ended up resulting in a system, basically how your character is managed and how you can manipulate the game is a whole lot easier without that system implemented. And there are some other things that I really don't like that they removed. You no longer have to keep track of weapon conditions and whatnot. I feel that that was something that shouldn't have been taken out, and it simplified the game. You know, your weapons are always going to do X amount of damage, and they will never break, which seems absolutely ridiculous to me. I found the fact that you instantaneously level up whenever you increase your skills enough was it wasn't as satisfying as having to go to an inn and sleep in a bed to level up. That's more or less a nitpick. But it's very small, tiny complexities that were removed that end up amounting to a much larger problem that detracts from the game. Something else that I really don't like is the fact that the compass system in the game literally points you directly to each character, and this is more or less my largest complaint with the game. It's the fact that it holds your hand oh so entirely and completely throughout the experience, because the quest pointers literally hover over the object or the person that you're supposed to find or interact with, and I found that to be very, very off-putting, because, I mean, yes, I want the quest markers because I want to be able to figure out where in Skyrim this dungeon is located, but I think that it went way too far to, you know, put the quest marker right on the object or the chest or the character or whatever it is, and as a result, basically anybody can go into the game and play through it and not have to think. And that's the biggest thing that detracts from the gameplay experience, in my opinion. The fact that you no longer have to think very hard as you play through the Elder Scrolls. There are countless things across the board for games in general that represent how games have been simplified and streamlined in order to appeal to the masses, because most people, or just the mass in general, they don't want to think while they play games. It's not necessarily a simplifying factor, and moreover, it's a feature that has resulted in the first-person shooter genre being wildly successful, such as Call of Duty. Iron sights, actually. And more specifically, iron sights in relation to a mechanic called Snap 2. That is to say, whenever, in a first-person shooter, whenever you snap to the iron sights on a gun, automatically the reticle is drawn to the closest enemy. And I can pretty much guarantee you right now, if that was never implemented in games to make shooting with a gun easier, the first-person shooter genre never would have taken off the way it has, and Call of Duty would not be as wildly successful as it is. For the pure fact that, you know, joysticks are not an inherently efficient way to move the targeting reticle around for a gun. And if it wasn't for that Snap to feature, I mean, if you've ever seen any of the Call of Duty montages on YouTube, I don't go looking at them specifically myself, but I have seen a few, and one thing is absolutely obvious, and it's the fact that whenever people are getting kill after kill after kill, they're basically snapping in and out of the iron sights over and over and over. And the reason they do that is because they're letting the system do all of the work to draw the reticle up to their enemies, so they don't really have to work too hard at authentically aiming at the character. And that's that's an enormous nitpick to me as a PC gamer, because whenever I play first-person shooters on the PC, I turn aim assist off because it messes with my capability to get headshots. And it's an enormous problem whenever I'm using the mouse. But at the exact same time, I can barely get through games on the console because I'm not inherently skilled with the joysticks, and at the exact same time, if it wasn't for that Snap to feature, I probably wouldn't get through the games at all. But like I said, there are an incredible number of things across the gaming industry in general. You know, going back to the question about survival horror genre, the reason why that's not as popular is because the mass doesn't like the concept of having to be patient and, you know, walk through the dark corridors and everything, and as a result, action horror is more successful because you don't have to spend time thinking, God, how am I going to conserve my bullets? You're spending more time thinking, oh, wow, how am I going to wipe out the mass? And it's just shoot, 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 don't think, etc., etc. And, you know, the term dumbing down, that more or less speaks to the idea that you don't have to think as hard to play the games, but at the exact same time, that's also referring to the system of making the games just flat out easier to play, where they're going to comfort you and, you know, say really nice things to you and not let you die that easily and whatnot. One of the biggest things that I can think of right off the top of my head is how most games today have a regenerating health system. If you get shot too many times, just hide for a little bit, and all of a sudden you'll be all better. I understand the idea of why this was implemented, and unless I'm mistaken, Halo is the game that really got this feature popularized in games. The entire concept that you don't actually have to have significant skill. You don't have to figure out how to avoid bullets and how to avoid damage long enough to be able to last the battle, or you have to find med packs in order to replenish your health, or you have to carry enough potions with you in order to stay alive. This entire system of making the game easier for people is really against my personal interest, is really a bit of an issue in my opinion, because the games, they're just so flippin' easy nowadays, and I can power through a lot of them very, very easily. It's very satisfying whenever I pick up a game and it says, no, you're not invincible, you're gonna have to work for that, which is the reason why games such as Demon's Souls, Dark Souls, Monster Hunter, those type of games that literally they stop you dead in your tracks and they say, no, you're not invincible, you need to start thinking about how you're playing this game. There's a reason why I really like those games, and I feel that playing through those types of titles that force you to think about what you're doing and make you weak, there's an incredible amount of reward in playing through those titles and knowing that you have to have some actual authentic skill. So, the dumbing down system, both in the fact that you no longer have to think about how to play the game, you're only given story-driven choices nowadays, and you don't so much have to have actual authentic gamer skill. You just have to rely on a leveling system to completely bypass the difficulty of the game, or you don't have to be concerned about saving your health or not getting hit so many times in a level because you just have to hide behind a rock in order to regain your health. Those type of things definitely fuel the problem, in my opinion, with the dumbing down and the simplification of games by and large. Now, obviously, there's not a whole lot that can be done about that because it's just the generalized evolution, and gaming has become progressively larger, and with a larger audience these things come, and in all honesty, I don't think that it can be stopped in any way, shape, or form. I think a good example of the clashing of the game design would be Duke Nukem Forever, which it had a combination of game design from yesteryear plus modern day design. And I really feel that the game suffered as a result. I remember whenever I played through the game, I was thinking to myself on a constant basis, it's really, really cool that whenever I perform a finisher on a foe, that Duke's ego gets replenished entirely. And the more I thought about it, and the more I went through the game and realized how much it actually sucked, I thought to myself, this game would have been a whole lot better if they got rid of his regenerating ego, and the only way to replenish it would have been to perform a finisher on an enemy, or possibly pick up some sort of a power-up. But the entire idea is that Duke Nukem Forever is a game that, really makes a good example out of how there's clashing problems with how difficult games used to be versus how easy games have become, and how they're catering to people who don't actually really know how to play the games and put any authentic work or effort into what they're doing. Moreover, I think that this is also driven forward by the fact that there's a lot of reliance on the multiplayer circuit today. And on the multiplayer circuit, while being good is important, I think that it's not exactly that great in the long run for the difficulty of games, because a lot of people rely on the system of respawn in order to offset their incapability to stay alive for a certain amount of time. And, that's debatable whether or not there's actually any ground to that claim, but I don't think that the multiplayer circuit is doing a whole lot of favors for video games in the long run whenever it comes to them remaining challenging. Now, I think that I've talked about this subject long enough, so to recap, the entire idea that I have going is how games are not so much asking the player to do things as much as they are saying the player can do what they want, and the game in turn caters to what they are interested in. Yes, this improves the fun factor, but it also means that games by and large are getting a whole lot easier so that people can continue to have fun without being challenged, which literally is the dumbing down of video games by and large. Alright, now that that's out of the way, let's move on to this week's last question. Okay, this is the last question this week, and it comes from Gamer9847, who asks, I'm not judging you or anything, but why did you name your YouTube account Link the First? And actually, user DGRoom101 ended up giving a somewhat partial response to this for me and said, Zelda games are amongst his favorites. Not sure if that is why, but I'd imagine it is. And DG Room, you are right. Zelda games are amongst my favorites, and it's the reason why I chose Link the First as my screen name. This is actually worth a little bit of backstory. Unlike most of you, I assume, I didn't have any experience with the internet and computers and, the World Wide Web and the interconnectivity until I was about 13 years old, which was back around the millennium. And whenever I started playing games then, it was, just a couple of years after The Legend of Zelda: The Ocarina of Time, which made my top 10 list a couple of weeks ago. And that game was, it basically consumed my life, and after I played The Ocarina of Time, I subsequently went back and played through every last Zelda game in existence. That's one of the few things that I actually am still proud of myself today. There is no official Nintendo Zelda title that I haven't played through today. Barring a few very obscure Zelda titles. But the entire deal is that back whenever my family got their first computer and we went online, I hung around on a lot of message boards, and obviously you have to have a screen name. And the primary place that I ended up hanging around was a website called hyrule.co.ar, and it had a fairly large message board attached to it. And whenever I had to come up with my screen name, because I was so into Zelda and trying to figure out, some sort of a timeline in relation to it all, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, at that point, was supposedly the earliest game in the timeline of Zelda in general. And I thought to myself, well, Link isn't available, so how about Link the First, the very first Link in the Zelda timeline? And at the time, that would have referred to Link from the Ocarina of Time. And that's how I chose my screen name. And ever since then, every time I make a new account anywhere, I really just more or less use the exact same name. If you do a Google search of, Link the First, just LINKTHE1ST, you'll get a lot of interesting hits of accounts that I have in various places. Granted, not everything is going to be authentic, and moreover, the last time I checked, most of the things that come through on a Google search, most of the content is in some way, shape, or form related to what I submit to YouTube here, and, basically grouping up and rearranging the videos in playlists and whatnot to redistribute them to other people. Most of the stuff that you get through a Google search is primarily just junk, but at the same time, if you really go through, I think, the first 3 or 4 pages, you'll actually find some interesting places where I hold accounts to this day. Whether or not I actually use them on a regular basis is another story. I mean, I hold accounts in a lot of different places on the net, and not all of them I still visit. But the short and simple of the answer is, my screen name, Link the First, refers to Link from The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. And I chose it back whenever I was about 13 years old, back during the millennium, whenever I was really, really into the Zelda series. Well, that's everything for this week. I want to say thanks to all of you for coming and listening to the podcast, and also for all of you who left questions for me to answer. Because it's going to be another week or two until I put another podcast up, be sure to come back to this specific video and drop a comment or a question here and there every once in a while for anything that you want me to answer whenever I return with the next season of Elements of Play and start putting podcasts out again. But until then, I hope you have a good time and have fun with the games you're playing. I know that I will be playing Diablo 3 quite a lot during the Reverie. But until then, have a good time. I'm William Strife, and I'll see you later.